This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, hosted by Joe Yule. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of Witches.
Welcome back to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, and this month consumer cooperatives, local business alliances, transition towns, permaculture projects and local finance initiatives are all coming together to celebrate the third World Localisation Day. Grassroots organisations are springing up all over the world, proving invaluable in communities affected by climate and COVID-related supply chain failures, which are now being further highlighted by the war in Ukraine. In fact, as devastating as the circumstances are, never was there such a recent and clear signpost that this way of importing goods and flying produce around the world doesn't work. So joining us all the way from Australia for today's episode is Local Futures founder and friend of the podcast, Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena is a linguist, author and filmmaker, and also a pioneer of the new economy movement. She was previously behind the International Society for Ecology and Culture, but created Local Futures as a non-profit organisation dedicated to the revitalisation of cultural and biological diversity and the strengthening of local communities and economies worldwide. So Helena, welcome back, and thank you so much for joining us here on the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast once again. How are you?
I am good, and I'm very happy to be here. I love you guys.
Well, we love you too. I'm really grateful that you could make the time for us again in your busy month of the year. I mean, so much has happened since we last spoke a year ago at the tail end of the pandemic. But I just wanted to start off with words that I found in the New York Times piece that profiled you recently, when a local farmer pointed out quite rightly at the farmers market that we've just been shown during the pandemic how fragile and not resilient things are. And he was referring obviously to the global supply chains that spread the coronavirus worldwide, but then struggled to deliver medical supplies. And I love the fact more than ever that the theory of localization has been proven and completely brought home, because as you rightly pointed out, resilience now comes from local producers. So I guess that message has become more relevant at some stage. And now it seems, you know, some of your theories have been showcased in reality. How are you sort of feeling about, you know, life after the pandemic in that way?
Well, I'm feeling that, yes, very, very clearly it's strengthened the interest in localization and many more initiatives, also discussions now, you know, from the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, looking at the fragility of global supply lines, which of course has also been strengthened by the war in Ukraine. And as you can see, there's more and more talk about the food supply. And so definitely awareness is growing. However, during the pandemic and even before that, what's going on is that the global system, primarily now in the hands of the techno giants and the financial giants, and I'm afraid linked to intelligence and the war machine, they're still pushing really hard in the opposite direction. And I worry a lot about the propaganda for robots, which is absolutely ubiquitous and at every level. And really, we have to recognize that this is a path that means replacing more people with scarce minerals, huge mining projects, more energy use. It's a really frightening path in the wrong direction. However, at the same time, you know, not only has the awareness about localization and its benefits grown, but also the number of people who are taking action at the local level. So the pandemic has also very clearly strengthened this path that we're recommending, which is about reconnecting people to each other, rebuilding the social fabric, and allowing us to slow down and feel our connections to nature and become more human again. So I'm both, well, basically it means I'm working harder because I can see that there is a big opening now, and we're really very, very keen to get this big picture out, because there is no doubt that the majority of humanity is ready for fundamental change. And there's also no doubt that there is a growing appetite for working with nature rather than being further and further removed from Mother Gaia. There's an appetite for community like there's never been before. So I feel the big problem is that this combination of high tech with big money makes it very difficult to get this message out. So I'm very glad for this podcast, and I'm very glad for the other voices out there that are primarily, by using alternative media, getting this message out. And yeah, we just have to keep it up. Get the big picture out there.
I think you're doing sterling work on that front, and you don't seem to be slowing down in any way, shape or form. I mean, you just mentioned obviously the war there that wasn't happening, when we last spoke last June. And I wonder, what are the biggest things that we've sort of seen change in terms of globalization as a result of that conflict?
Well, the most clear one right now is the concern about the food supply. I think also that the whole COVID pandemic, as you know, created a lot of skepticism about the role of global corporations, the UN, the World Economic Forum. And again, I would just love to get our voice out, because having met with even Nobel Prize-winning economists, ministers, prime ministers, people in Nestle, in Unilever, and various corporations, I'm absolutely convinced that this sort of battle right now is not so much about good guys and bad guys. And there's an unfortunate tendency for people at the grassroots who rightly grew very skeptical about what's going on, from the top down. They tend to look at this much too much in terms of individuals and a sort of politics of identity, rather than trying to understand the structures and the reason why we've ended up in this crazy situation where banks and corporations are in effect ruling the world. And so I feel that, that what's definitely happening, since we last spoke, is that there is more skepticism, there's more awareness, but there's also, as I say, a tendency for people at the grassroots to simply dismiss all the people in power as having evil intent, being greedy, selfish, people who are amassing wealth and power. My sense is that the main reason we're in this bloody mess is that blindness at every level, the blindness to really understanding the global system. That is the situation that has led to, ministers in government not having any idea why and how it is that in virtually every country, the gap between rich and poor is widening in an obscene and obvious way. They're not being forced to see that there's a link between that and the disastrous impact on not just climate, but extinction of species, toxic chemicals, an epidemic of cancer, an epidemic of anxiety and depression. No one has been briefed with stepping back to look at the connection between this escalating, globalizing corporate path and these disastrous impacts on every form of life. And so I think, again, with the war, unfortunately, what can happen is more divisiveness and people buying into the rhetoric around, evil Russia and noble America and moving into another sort of Cold War. And from my point of view, that's all because of ignorance about the economic trajectory which has been supported by virtually every government, from Sweden to Russia and to the US. This economic trajectory has been founded in destroying local economies, inducing more and more resources, and we're talking about water, minerals, every form of resource, to produce less and less, and to destroy jobs and livelihoods with it, and of course to destroy democracy. So the big picture, where some of us are now willing to step back and look at how on earth have we ended up in this situation, and to understand that from a global point of view. This is not just about the discussions at the World Economic Forum, a few people who, if we could get rid of them, everything would be fine. No, this is a structural problem that started with the birth of the modern economy. It very clearly started with very explicit voices from the white global traders who set, in motion both enclosures in Europe, set in motion slavery, genocide, with overt, racist, anti-nature, anti-women, misogynist values. That system was set in motion by destroying local economies, driving people away from the land. And, typically in the so-called third world, they were driven away to work on huge monocultures of cotton, tea, or in mines, to provide for the industrial processes, which in turn benefited from cheap labor from people who had been enclosed and pushed off the land. Fundamentally, the modern economy has always been based on destroying self-reliance. What I came to realize in Ladakh was that this, in the modern era, was fundamentally linked to also destroying self-esteem and targeting young children through media to feel ashamed, backward, stupid if they didn't join the urban consumer culture. So it's a lot, I suppose, to say there. I'm hoping that our new film, which we're calling Planet Local, A Quiet Revolution, helps people to look at some of these connections. And more than anything, I want to plead with the listeners to be willing to just take a bit of time to step back and look at the big picture in order to strengthen this movement. Broadly speaking, we're calling it localization. But remember, it's synonymous with moving towards genuine human and ecological healing. It's moving in the direction of responding to our needs for connection and community, our needs to be healthy, both emotionally and physically.
I mean, right now, obviously, more and more people are kind of feeling this pinch of financial stress, and hunger is increasing globally. Obviously, you've just talked about with the war, the stress on global food supply. And I think, obviously we have heard, as you just rightly pointed out, that it's because of COVID or China or Russia, but it seems, there could be a deeper systemic reason. And I wonder if you could kind of just explain that in a bit more detail for us.
Yeah, well, definitely. So the reason why we now have food shortages is that, again, from the very beginning of this modern economy, the pressure has been to destroy people's food self-reliance. People who were producing a range of products for their own needs were pushed either through the enclosures or slavery to produce for the global traders. It reached already at the beginning of this modern globalization period, which is roughly in the mid-80s, this had already reached such ridiculous and obscene proportions where governments were routinely importing and exporting the same product. The US exporting beef, importing beef, the UK exporting milk and butter, importing, and roughly in the same quantities. At the same time, it wasn't just food, but in, timber, slate, plastic, waste, water, going back and forth. in larger and larger quantities, because from the outset, this economic model assumed and kept telling us that being self-reliant was drudgery, was subsistence, and that we had to do everything we could to get away from that, and that it was in our interest to specialize for export. And this was founded in one of the primary economic formulas, which is called the principle of a comparative advantage. And the idea was that, don't you waste your time producing a bunch of things that you're not so good at. You should specialize, export, and then import everything you need. Up to a certain point, that makes sense, and you can understand why on the surface people could buy into it. But it had already, by the 80s, reached these criminally obscene proportions, because all of the time, as food was imported and exported, it was linked to destroying small farmers. And that means essentially destroying healthy, genuine farming. It was all the time, which had already started after the war, replacing farmers with more and more fossil fuels, more and more technology. And those fossil fuels, as we know, weren't used just for the machinery. They were used for the pesticides, for the chemical fertilizers. And they were beginning to create a situation where the soil was dying and where our health was affected by the pesticides and so on. So we, along with many other groups around the world, were trying to raise awareness about this already back then. Now, this whole process has accelerated. And of course, from about the 90s, not only did we deal with these pesticides and chemical fertilizers, but now it was hybridized, genetically modified seeds. By the way, the research often funded by governments to produce seeds that actually had terminator genes in them. They were produced through genetic manipulation to ensure that farmers would not be able to plant again with those seeds. Not only that, most of the funding for genetic engineering was going into how could they create crops that could tolerate more pesticides, more fungicide, more glyphosate. It's mad. And yet the average person in the street had no idea. We were being told that we need bigger and bigger farms, bigger and bigger supermarkets to feed the world. The truth is that small diversified farms can produce vastly more per unit of land and water. What they do need is people. They need jobs. It's a job-rich path. The other path that uses more and more chemicals, more and more genetic modification, more and more technology, replaces people and produces less food per unit of land and water. It's highly inefficient. We have on this earth an overabundance of human beings. It's a bit problematic, but this overabundance of human beings, if they were liberated from the yoke of this economic system, which the yoke is primarily the ideas that are foisted on us, a propaganda machine that comes out from giant corporations that know that in order for them to keep amassing profit for the few, they need to keep this path alive. I want to come back to that, because having said that, it makes them sound so evil. And it's an evil system, no doubt. But I know that the individuals who promote a lot of these ideas actually believe them themselves, because there's not been the big picture. No one has been briefly stepping back to look at the truth of what's going on. So as people are bought into these myths, they've gone along with, oh my God, how are we going to feed the world? Yes, we need genetic engineering. I've known really well-intentioned scientists, geneticists, who believed that message, who actually thought that they were working for the good of humankind by working in the field of genetic engineering. And in many cases, the ones I've worked with woke up, but often only by chance. Like one of them was a woman geneticist from the University of Indiana, and her name was Marty Crouch. She was convinced that she was doing the right thing. It was only by chance on holiday in India that she ran into small farming organizations that were trying to get their voices heard, to explain that it was having exactly the opposite effect. So to come back then again to what's been going on and what's happening now, if we could, in a compassionate, open-minded, open-hearted way, be willing to step back to look honestly at some of these fundamental assumptions about the economy, about progress, about technology, we would make, we could make enormous we could see an enormous progress in building coalitions between all these hundreds of millions of people around the world who are working for what, for a better world, for what they believe in. But at the moment, many of the climate activists, for instance, have become convinced that the reduction in energy consumption is going to mean that the average person has to pay a big price, that it's about sacrifice in the population, that we're going to need to go back to a much more primitive way of life. They believe that there is this essentially a contradiction between human needs and the needs of the environment. And tragically, many of the social activists who are concerned about poverty or concerned about the terrible pressures people are under now, they believe also that doing something about the environment is going to mean sacrifice for people. When we look around the world today, we're seeing these two fundamentally divergent paths, systemic path. One of them pushed by our governments and giant global corporations. The other is being pushed more strongly all around the world from the bottom up. In every institution, you will find alternative voices. In universities, in government departments, in corporations, you will find people saying, we need fundamental change. We care about the environment. We care about community. We're very concerned about the loss of democracy. And they're sort of saying, what's going on? But almost no one in the world has been briefed with stepping back to look at this from a global perspective. And so from our point of view, what we see is that the voices that we're gathering around us are usually people who've had a lot of international experience. And unfortunately, they're fairly rare because on the ground, the voices who are saying enough is enough. We care about climate. We care about justice. We care about this terrible pressure now on the cost of the people are, running faster and faster just to pay for the rent, just to pay for food. And so the concern about people's hardship, the concern about poverty, the concern about race, about gender, about the epidemic of anxiety, all of these concerns are generally coming from a more single issue perspective. They're generally coming from also within a relatively narrow national perspective. So where we start seeing more clearly what's going on and where we can be more clear about which systemic path we want to support is with this more global view. And I'm just hoping that people will be willing to take a little bit of time to step back, to look at this bigger picture, and to rejoice once they see the bigger picture, what's going on from the bottom up. And like I say, the bottom up isn't just some small farmers in India or in Brazil. It's actually the alternative voices in economics, from universities, from within corporations, from within government. There are alternative voices, but they are not getting out into the mainstream media. They are not being supported by this system, which is now more and more shaped by big money, algorithms circulating in a casino to every day influence our thinking. Virtually every avenue of knowledge has been colonized from within science and within universities, even in school books, History has been rewritten to support a path of progress that is destroying life. And that means human beings, their health, their physical health, their mental health. So we need to be clear about that. And we need to be clear that within that machine of algorithms creating vast amounts of wealth out of thin air, that this system ends up confusing and blinding the thinking even of people within those corporations, within the financial institution. So where are the voices we can listen to? Where are the voices where we can really get some clarity? Like I say, again, we find in our network that most of them are people with a lot of international experience. And there are people who have begun to see that there's a pattern, there's a bigger pattern at play. And I hope, one of them I would say is Russell Brand. And the international experience that he's had is also includes a very important experience of growing up at this, as it were, at the bottom end of this ladder of competition and consumerism, ending up at the top of it and realizing how empty and how damaged he was by this competitive culture where we're pushed into believing that if you're famous, if you're rich, if you're part of that elite, then you'll be happy. And when we look honestly at this, we'll actually see that reaching that top for most people has made them feel empty, absolutely removed from any real sense of community or connection, either community or connection to people or even to animals, to plants, to the living world. So I think there are so many lessons out there. Once you start seeing through this big picture lens, the pattern is so clear. And I'd like to add to this sort of rather dismal picture that what becomes so clear is that the effective therapies, for instance, that Russell Brand also talks about, that include group connection, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, that include people coming together in a real human group, human scale, a deep conversation about who they are, their fears, their imperfections, their vulnerability. Sharing that is a fundamental building block of healing. And so in Local Futures, we recommend this as a very important step for people who want to start looking at how can they heal and how this is connected to a global healing, a planetary healing. So we urge people to come together in human scale groups with like-minded people wherever they live. It can be 3 people up to maybe 20, probably about maximum, because you need to try to have one deep conversation in an ongoing way. And that can lead to the most remarkable, rapid healing when that's combined with a spiritual journey of reconnecting with nature, with other forms of life, with horses, with dogs, with any form of life, with the mountains, with an awareness of the clouds and this a miracle of life around us. When those two are combined, that opening up of our hearts, our souls, our bodies to the miracle of life in humans and in non-humans, there is healing, and we can see it all around the world. What we see is that so many of these projects have had to struggle from the bottom up. They've had almost no support from government. They've had almost no finance. They've had almost no media coverage, but they are being born and created everywhere in the world. So even just recently, a woman here in Australia was allowed to bring horses that had been race horses that were just going to be slaughtered. She started a project of bringing these horses into prisons. And again, with remarkable effects. You have examples of even bringing a dog into an old people's home. You have examples of prisoners who have been allowed to learn how to garden, and along with that, to connect to each other in a human, really deep and community-based way. And yeah, it's just, I could give you countless examples, but I just want people to be aware that when you start looking through these broader, big picture lenses, and you see these patterns around the world, what it does is to restore your faith in humanity, to restore your faith in nature and the healing power of nature and human beings. And it's very sad to me to see that part of the dominant, top-down, corporate, commercial path has been repeating again and again, particularly since this latest form of globalization. Since the mid-'80s, the message has been, we are greedy and aggressive by nature. It's human beings. And now this is being reinforced with huge propaganda for robots. I recently was in the embarrassing position to have said I would speak after a film that was promoting meditation and mindfulness. And I said, I'd be happy to do so. To my horror, this film included sections where a lovely-looking, intelligent American scientist was telling us about her remarkable work with robots, including Sophia, the robot. And in the film, she says that human beings are usually, always a bit judgmental. So robots can actually maintain an impartial, compassionate relationship with people. So in the film, they show Sophia teaching people compassion and meditation, and with this horrifying message that we human beings aren't capable of that because we're too judgmental. We have to leave it to robots to show genuine, non-judgmental compassion. Watch out for this. This propaganda includes arguments that we'll be able to have much more information about all the technological testing. Mammograms aren't good enough. Now, thanks to AI, they'll be able to even tell us exactly when our problem started. And we're being told that education through AI will be able to target individual children with their individual needs. Now, this is a humongous lie. This is exactly the opposite of what AI is already doing to our lives. When, we sit on the phone for hours trying to talk to someone at an airline or a government office or, to pay taxes, whatever it might be, hours listening to robots, and we're longing for a human being. Finally, a human voice is there. But unfortunately, these are people subservient to this monolithic, monocultural, top-down system. So they sound like robots themselves. They can't relate to the individual circumstances of an individual trying to get information about a specific situation. So, yeah, this big picture needs right now to be very clear about the role of technology.
Once upon a time in Ibiza
with Alex Gray. Sweet, wild island, don't give up on us. We travelled far and wide, running away from our truth inside. The seeking of our soul through the sages and the beads, we have sacrificed our roots, our community, its needs. A collective adventure for nourishment, we sailed the 7 seas. A false economy and prophecy will only have us on our knees. We flee to the edges, awaiting the homecoming of a boat. Filled with mangoes and coconuts, an abundance of sauce we gloat. As the sun rises over our island, a beam of light so bright, a feast of fruit before our eyes, growing from the tree ancient and wise. We want it all organic, tropical and sweet. The colors of the rainbow cool us down from the summer heat. A guava from Guatemala, an avocado from Peru, a mango from Mexico, and a pineapple from you-know-who.
Let the climate devastation we have caused make us pause our overwhelming need to consume, to breed. Import, export, political consort, international dreaming, blindly following the feeling. Alas, we return, the nest is bare, the land of our existence, barren beyond the resistance. We stand, repentant, naked skin, red earth, land keepers, regeneration seekers, farmers of soil enriched with their worth. Recoiling our gaze, we walk away from the haze, our hearts become focal on the love for our local. People, places, plants, bees. Our people, our faces, our planet, our seeds. One love, one sun, there is work to be done. A vow we now make for a circle of one.
So, I mean, it seems that on every continent there is a quiet revolution that's emerging, obviously fueled also by, the conversations that you've been having, this amazing month of June that you put together every year. People are seeking out community, I think, more than ever before, and, collaborating and turning to ways of life that nurture the natural world instead of destroying it. I mean, what are the kind of best ways that we can sort of help celebrate and amplify the worldwide movement for localization, moving away from these top-down systems and obviously people turning towards robots for lessons in compassion? That is incredibly worrying.
Well, first of all, we really recommend that people try to find a little group of like-minded people. And that it could be, anything from 3 up to about 20 people, and to start this process of deep sharing that I was talking about earlier. But we also recommend that people, if they really look at the bigger picture, they'll see how fundamental the transformation in food and farming has been, and that they will see that localizing, creating more localized food economies is a way forward. It means now, again, seeing through some of the propaganda coming from the top down. There's huge propaganda for keeping us narrowly focused just on how we produce the food. So the latest buzzword is regenerative agriculture. Well, that doesn't say quite enough to prevent Kellogg's and giant corporations, Unilever, from boasting about doing regenerative agriculture or supporting it. We've got to be more holistic. The big picture is about being more holistic. We've got to start looking at the whole trajectory from the seed to the table. And as a friend of ours also now is making a film about, from the seed to the table and back again. In other words, where do we compost and how? So this means let's look at more diversified, smaller scale farming, closer to the market. As we start that process of shortening distances, we are starting to heal our own health, the health of the soil, the health of the planet. There is nothing more destructive than the global food economy. And as we were saying earlier, that global food economy is making us increasingly vulnerable. It's destroying the soil itself. And now the propaganda is again that robots are going to be farming. We're going to do indoor agriculture. No, let's really look at the truth and support these smaller scale, diversified local food economies. A lot of people think, oh, well, that's already happening. We have a farmer's market in my neighborhood of London or New York. It's not enough. We've got to really see that there's a huge amount of work to be done in that area of rebuilding the local food systems, and that it is one of the most rewarding areas. It's one of the most rich areas that people get more joy out of in those local food systems. That's where, well, maybe I've said it already, that's where people see the most rapid and most rewarding effects. as people work on rebuilding local food economies, they see the most remarkable effects very rapidly. So it's the most rewarding area to focus on. And as I say, it builds community, it restores biodiversity. It's an amazing win-win-win trajectory. Once people wake up to the fact that the global food economy is the biggest cause of climate change, the biggest cause of these mountains of plastic, the biggest cause of the breakdown of healthy societies and communities, the biggest cause of this epidemic of health problems, of diabetes, of the fact that this generation is going to live less long than the parent generation. We're going backwards. The food economy is the most fundamental. So I urge people to join that and to really help to strengthen it. I can't tell you how frustrating it is that in our work, it's very hard to find people who are actually promoting this localizing path. There's so much propaganda in the other way that makes many people on the left a bit afraid of local, because the corporate world keeps putting out that localizing means some kind of selfish right-wing protectionism. There's also, as I say very often, when people focus on food, they tend to just focus on how is the food being produced. You know, is it organic? Is it regenerative? Is it permaculture? But we really need to move beyond that to look at this fact that the global market pushes for bigger and bigger monocultures, and with huge pressure. On the other side, the markets that are closer to the farm actually create economic pressure towards diversification. And that's one of the most important facts in this whole discussion about food.
Have you read George Monbiot's new book called Regenesis, about the regeneration of food?
I am so upset. I've known George for a long time, and I'm shocked and horrified. And this is what's happening, is that he's been influenced by statistics, by supposed facts, to rightly argue that the agricultural system is the most destructive, but has not had enough experience or understanding at the grassroots around the world to realize that small, highly diversified farms produce vastly more food per unit of land and water. And as it happens, they need more people on the land. And you know, the reality of working on one of these smaller farms in local food systems, the reality is that people have enjoyable, diversified work. It builds healthy people, healthy communities. And there are so many young people who are turning away from the screen, leaving the city, wanting to engage in farming. Another fact is that we have a lot of high-tech billionaires, a lot of billionaires from the finance world, from the media, deciding that they want to farm, and that is one of the most enjoyable activities they've ever encountered. Once we start again looking at that bigger picture, it becomes very clear that he's mainly talking nonsense. And the idea that we should be synthetically manufacturing our food is ideal for this techno-economic corporate juggernaut.
I'm glad you said that, because there's been just so many posts recently about, people sort of saying, bringing fish farms onto the land is just, so much more beneficial in terms of the waste and the way that, the land is treated, and, how much more ecological it is. But I just, I'm not buying into that, if I'm going to be really honest. And it feels like, you've kind of described, I think in one of the places on your website, that your definition of regeneration as being one of bottom up, with the emergence of greater abundance and equilibrium, which you say happens through reciprocal relationships. And I think, that happens on the farm, that happens with the interaction of people buying their food locally. And it's an interesting thing, because I think, of course, tech billionaires are going to be pushing this narrative forward, but ultimately, that's not how we're going to get the best out of our regeneration, as you put it. I think it's also interesting to talk about what happened in Thailand, which is the latest victim of the investor-state dispute settlement case. And I thought it was very interesting with your point about how free trade destroys our soil health, which I think is obviously, exactly as you've just been saying, one of the most important things to fight against climate change. It's just not just local food, but it's also, the state of the land. Can you kind of explain that situation a little bit more in detail for people that maybe don't really understand what's happened there?
Well, yes. I mean, this is something that has been going on for a while, and that is that governments are now routinely signing onto trade treaties where they say, we will not do anything to reduce your profit-making potential to giant corporations, because these trade treaties are not, as we think, just about agreements between different countries. Free trade has been already from the Bretton Woods institutions after the Second World War. What was set up was the so-called General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, along with the World Bank and the IMF. The idea at that point was that we need to integrate or harmonize all economic activity around the world to avoid another depression, to avoid another war. So many good people, politicians, people of all kinds, agreed with this. What wasn't being very clearly seen was that this arrangement of having the IMF and the World Bank and these trade treaties coordinated from Washington, from the Pentagon, was actually helping most of the world's economies. What wasn't recognized was that it was helping global corporations to have more freedom to move in and out of every economy. Now, that's been going on since that time. And now for it's actually more than that. It's probably the last 30 years. These treaties have included not just the freedom to the corporations to move around as they please, but literally these clauses called ISDS clauses, which means investor-state dispute settlements. And those clauses say you will not do anything that might reduce our profit-making potential. If you do, we will take you to a kangaroo court. So this is what's going on in Thailand. It's what's been going on even, between, with Canada wanting to limit some chemicals that had been proven harmful to the environment, sued by the corporation. A Swedish nuclear power company suing Germany, and they decided to phase out nuclear power after Fukushima. So it's an absolutely obscene and so destructive situation that this is going on. I want to come back again, though, to say that I honestly and truly, I've met enough ministers and enough corporate CEOs and bankers and so on to realize that they are not being forced to look at the big picture. So they are often absolutely convinced that they're doing what is necessary. They're so locked into a path of progress, assumptions about trade, assumptions about growth. Let's remember, they're measuring everything, first of all, just according to numbers of GDP, of bottom line. As the CEO of, I often use examples, the CEO of Exxon had to run scared because as they merge with Mobil, who's going to be the CEO that's left? So there's this absolute mad rush, competing and adhering to concepts, adhering to a measurement like GDP. All of us citizens, every environmentalist should be up in arms about GDP. Literally, an increase in cancer in your country contributes to GDP. An increase in environmental pollution contributes to GDP. If we stay healthy, if we reduce emissions by growing some of our own food, we are being unpatriotic. GDP will go down because it simply measures commercial transactions. Now, if not even environmentalists are dealing with this, let's not assume that Klaus Schwab should be so clear-minded that he would be saying, oh, no, we must stop using GDP. I do, when I get frustrated, it's more with the George Monbiot's, with the environmentalists of this world, for not looking, clearly enough and being willing to recognize the fact that it's the economic system that is the father of both social and environmental destruction, and now very obviously making a total mockery of democracy. So again, we need real clarity about not supporting that path, and the clarity not to demonize those people who are still promoting it. We need to have real clarity also about the fact that when we start examining what's going on in terms of this flowering of community building, of greater self-reliance, healing the soil, healing people's anxiety and depression by helping people to come together. When we see all these things going on at the grassroots, there is so much reason to feel inspired, to feel hopeful, and to have faith in humankind. And this is what our film, Planet Local, A Quiet Revolution, tries to spell out. Among other things in that film, from a conversation between Gabor Mate and me, Gabor talks about the fact that, we've had so much misinformation because of the economic system. And that misinformation includes this idea that we're aggressive and competitive by nature. He's making the point that there is nothing in our neurophysiology that actually conforms to aggression, but there is so much in us physiologically that conforms with the need to love and to be loved. And this is just shorthand for some of his wisdom. But I do believe that ultimately life will win. The human inclination towards collaboration and towards genuine connection will win. We really need to wake up. We need the big picture as soon as possible.
Let's finish on a very positive note. I mean, what's the one thing that's like giving you hope this year? I mean, obviously you've created this absolutely amazing month again. This is the 3rd year of World Localisation Day. You've done some amazing work. You've launched this new amazing short film series that you just mentioned with the Planet Local. What's the one thing or the one person perhaps that you maybe had a conversation with in the run up to this event this year that's really inspired you?
Well, in the run up to World Localisation Day, I have to say every day I am so inspired by the number of wise, compassionate, hardworking individuals we're in touch with. I feel so gifted with the fact that I ended up interacting with so many wonderful, inspiring people. And I would say, of course, that because for me, it's so much about the big picture. It's about the concepts. It's about people being confused and pushed towards treating symptoms rather than dealing with root causes. So the most heartening thing is to see a process of wake up that is beginning to move upwards. So we're even beginning to see little voices coming into the mainstream. One of the important ones there was a book called Humankind, which actually reached pretty large audience, which was after a long period of this propaganda that we human beings are just aggressive and greedy by nature. Something that was reinforced by Yuval Harari, and many people, thought of his voice as a radical voice, not realizing that the main message was actually reinforcing this very destructive and wrong conception of human beings. But Humankind, a book by someone named Bregman, a Dutchman, spelled out exactly the opposite and gave lots of examples. And this kind of opening up to fundamental rethinking, really questioning the path of progress. What constitutes genuine progress? Who are human beings really? What is it we want? Are we really just wanting to make more money and to consume more gadgets? All the evidence says no. But people are struggling to just put food on the table and to pay for their, roof over their head. So, of course, there's going to be a concern on their side for some kind of financial security. And the wonderful thing is that if you have clarity about the economy, we can offer financial security, economic security, more secure livelihoods, along with a healthier environment, more community, slowing down. And this picture is building up in what you might broadly call the new economy movement. So again, my great hope and inspiration comes from the big wake up that is beginning to happen.
You've just, managed to get together just such an incredible lineup of people to talk about World Localisation Day. And obviously this whole month has been an inspiration. I think, I just wanted to briefly just touch on your interaction with Thich Nhat Hanh and his centre at the Plum Village in France, because I was very sad to see that he passed at the start of this year. But what would you say that you've learned from him in terms of the message that you're working towards?
Well, I would say that Thich Nhat Hanh was one of those spiritual leaders who really understood the importance of living in the here and now. And I would argue that localization is a structural path that would allow us in our everyday lives to live in the here and now, because it's precisely about restoring those everyday experiences, which when we're closer to nature and to community, it's a joy. It's what life is all about. We don't need to be climbing some ladder to be more important, to be more rich. It's a path that allows us to work with that reality of the here and now. And he was a beautiful teacher in precisely spelling out the importance of that.
Helena, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time today. I know that this is your busiest month of the whole year, but it's been an absolute joy to listen to all of your incredible knowledge and all of the incredible goals that you're working towards to spread this message far and wide. And I'm really excited to watch some more of the films that you mentioned. And is there anything else that you wanted to share before we finish?
There will be some events on Ibiza for World Localisation Day. And so I hope people will look at our website for that. And we would love people to be in touch with us. So please write to us. We also, fairly recently, we put out a localization action guide that people might find helpful. And so I would urge people who are interested to go to localfutures.org and to delve deeply, because we have so much material there. So if you're at all interested in localization, you should think of us as the library of thinking and examples to go to.
Amazing, Helena. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from down under in Australia. We're wishing you the most wonderful month of June. And thank you so much for making the time to join us.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for doing the Gang of Witches. It's wonderful.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Joe Yule. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves. Upon my witches everywhere, my witches everywhere. I'm calling upon my sisters everywhere, my brothers everywhere. The time has come to gather.